If you'll join me, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39 as we're starting to bring the book of Genesis in for a landing as the year is quickly drawing closed. One of my children was celebrating that it will be November before we gather again next week. And so time just keeps marching. The first quarter of school is done. My kids are starting to ask about Christmas presents and those sorts of things. I'm sure none of yours are. It's exciting to kind of bring a year to a close and to think about what 2020 is going to bring for us. And I'm excited about all that the Lord is going to do and the plans and the stuff that He is beginning to work out for the next year. It's exciting. If you'll join me, Genesis chapter 39, we're gonna catch up with Joseph. If you will remember, if you were around 2 weeks ago when we left Joseph was beaten up, bloodied, naked, thrown into a hole by his brothers. They were going to murder him. One of the brothers talked them out of murder so that he could profit, sold him instead to slavers who were on their way to Egypt. So that's where we left Joseph. We had a little interlude we looked at last week in chapter 38, where that brother who had decided to sell him, whose name was Judah, did a variety of things last week that we looked at. And now we're going to pick back up our story with Joseph. And for the most part, the rest of Genesis is going to kind of be tracing this family's story and seeing what God has been able to do when it looked like, when by all accounts, right, it seems like the plan of God had been thwarted. We're going to see how God still moves and works. Genesis chapter 39, verse number 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph. We're going to see that multiple times in this section. The Lord was with Joseph. And he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he, that's Potiphar, made him, Joseph, overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am. Nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hands and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." And then she laid up his garments by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." And as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Now, this is a story that for many of us, perhaps we've heard, right? A story of a guy whose life he had made a mess of. Right, 2 weeks ago, Joseph he was this arrogant, prideful, manipulative, lying guy who gave false witness and testimony about his brothers to his dad. He was the favored one of his dad. His dad had given him the coat, right? He's telling his brothers and his dad and his family about the dreams where everybody's going to bow down to him. And the result of that, right? The result of Joseph's wickedness became his beating, right? He's bloodied and naked and thrown in a hole and sold into slavery. And part of us, in the midst of that story, goes, well, isn't that sort of what he deserves? He's a bad guy. And part of what God does with bad guys is he allows the consequences of their sin and their behavior to catch up to them as part of his redemption process, right? It's part of how he brings people around the corner. Sometimes he lets the consequences of their actions fall upon them. And it's part of how they get to rock bottom. That's our term, right? When's somebody going to get to rock bottom? Meg and I have a friend who has a drug addiction, and we have countless times looked at one another and said, is this going to be the bottom? Is this going to be the end? Is this going to be, are they finally going to have come to the end of themselves? Is this going to be enough loss in their life that they'll see and that they'll turn and that they'll walk in a different direction? And quite frankly, it has not happened for them yet, but they keep making the mess, and we keep going, is this the Lord? The Lord is bringing judgment into their life. And that's what we might have 2 weeks ago thought about Joseph's story. But it seems like, right, he's come around, and now here he is, and he's in Potiphar's house. Now, Potiphar, that captain of the guard, that's a term with a lot of weight to it. We might think sort of captain of the guard, the guy that maybe like stands in the castle, or that just like sort of stands beside the king and protects him. What it really is a much broader term. I think it's in 2 Kings maybe. The term gets used for the guy who's the chief general of the Babylonian army that goes in and lays waste to all of Jerusalem. This is like the head of the Department of Defense. This is the chief of the army. This is the big dog general. This is the guy who is second in command probably in all of the land, who, if something would happen to the king, this is the guy who would rule in his stead. And Joseph is in his house, providentially, right? We're not going to talk a lot about providence, but God is going to move and orchestrate and arrange, right? That it's not just anybody who purchases Joseph as a slave, but it's this guy who purchases Joseph, who Joseph comes into his household now, and over time, right? Joseph, because the Lord is with him, because the favor of the Lord is upon him, because Joseph has been transformed, we're going to see that his character has been wholly changed. This is a different kind of guy. And we're going to see that in the midst of this life, in this household where he now finds himself, he is going to experience 3 temptations. And so we're going to spend our time this morning thinking about the 3 temptations of Joseph. The first of those temptations is power. The temptation of power. Here he is, right? He's in this house of power, and it says to us that there is nothing in the house except for the food that Potiphar eats that Joseph is not in charge of. Now, sometimes idioms and euphemisms and sort of figurative language in the Bible can be a little bit different because they were different, 4,000 years ago than they are today. And so many scholars, I will not say all, I won't even maybe say most, but many scholars believe that in charge of everything but his food was a euphemism for he's allowed to be in charge of everything except sleeping with the wife. And we see the parallel of that, right? When Joseph is answering her, he says, listen, your husband has put me in charge of everything. I've got access to everything except for you. And it parallels the except for the food that he eats. That's why we think those are euphemisms. So what's it saying? It's saying to us that Joseph has risen to the place of power. Joseph's got rule over the other slaves. He's got rules, right? He's got rules over the kitchen and the house and probably the crops and the food, like all of it. Everything but the wife, Joseph is in power over. And this makes him, right, one of the most powerful, certainly the most powerful slaves in all of the land, maybe one of the most powerful people in all of the land, and the Lord is with him and blessing it. This is a fulfillment, right? If you remember all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, several months ago, when God is looking at Abraham and says, listen, your line, not only are your descendants going to be like the stars, but they're going to bless the nations. This is the beginning. This is sort of the first fruits of that, where we see Joseph in his relationship with the Lord and the blessing that comes. The result is the blessing of the house of Potiphar. It's being multiplied. There's favor, right? All of this stuff is going well, to the spot where Joseph is just gaining fame and gaining a name and gaining power. Now, we're going to see here in a second, there are two very different ways of handling power. One is going to be the way we're going to see Joseph handle his power. The other is the way we see Potiphar's wife, right? Because she's the one thing that Joseph doesn't have power over. She is the wife of the guy who is the second in command in all of the land. She would have had power, right? She has got a voice. She's got servants. She's probably got the ears of the other wives in her circle. This is a woman of power, and you can tell because of the way that she deals with Joseph. Now, this is not a love affair. This is not Potiphar has gone off and he's like, he's out doing generally sort of things, and over candlelight dinners there's been this great relationship that's been built, and Joseph sort of wandered like a sheep down the aisle and can't imagine. Like, he's got googly eyes for this woman. No, this woman simply looks at Joseph, who is, the text tells us, he's handsome, he's shapely. This is a guy, right? He's buff. He's apparently a very attractive man. And she looks at him, desires him, and says, lie with me. That is two Hebrew words that essentially say, sex now. That's it. This is a command of power. We're going to talk about the temptation of sex. That's the second one that's coming. But this is about power. This is about her saying, I'm in charge. You think you're in charge? You think that you, Joseph, have risen to this place, and maybe she's jealous. She's jealous of the relationship that he has with her husband. Maybe she's jealous that this guy who is the servant has risen and has the reputation that he has. And she is saying, I'm in charge. You are going to lie with me now. Joseph, though, think about Joseph's response. Think about Joseph's response to power. Think about Joseph, who holds all of this, and now in this moment. See, if Joseph was really interested in sort of consolidating power, if Joseph was someone who thought that this worldly power, right, if he was the old guy, the old manipulator, liar, fabricator, if he was the one who was really interested in that, he would have slept with her. He would have gained an ally. He would have consolidated those sorts of things, but that's not what he does. Nothing is withheld with him except for her. But he doesn't use that power in this way. See, Joseph has been using his power, his rise, his ascension, his success for the good, for the blessing. He's been doing it, right? Recognizing that God is the one who has put him in this place. Think about his response to her. Why would I do this thing? This is a sin against the Lord. The Lord has prescribed a way for me to handle my business, and this is not it. I don't answer to you. I don't really even answer to Potiphar. I answer to God himself. See, Joseph sees and knows and recognizes that his success, that the power he possesses, the resources at his disposal aren't his. They aren't Potiphar's. They're certainly not Potiphar's wife's. They're God's himself. So Joseph uses power but is not used by it. That's the first temptation. The second temptation that we see this morning is the sexual temptation. Now, sometimes the church, right, Christianity, evangelicalism, there's a lot, whatever word kind of that you want to, gets accused of being obsessed with sex. That we want to talk about it, we want to sort of, condemn everybody for it, The Bible actually talks way more about power and money and hell than sex, but it does talk about sex here, so we will talk about sex this morning. Potiphar's wife says, have sex with me now. Come lie with me. Come participate in this action and this activity that brings two people together. What is she doing? What she's doing is, right, we said she's demonstrating her power, but she's asking Joseph to participate with her in a sexual union, in the coming together, right, of two bodies. And what it reveals is that she, like culture today, like culture, quite frankly, throughout time, doesn't actually understand what sex is for. It doesn't get what the purpose of it is. See, there's two reasons. And Joseph goes, I'm not going to do this because it's a sin against God. There's two reasons that it's sinful. One is, she is married to Potiphar. And the second reason is she's not married to Joseph. See, it's not just that it's adultery. It's not just that she is married to Potiphar. But she isn't married to Joseph. It's both things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, later on, Paul, in one of his epistles to the church at Corinth, he lays out, we don't have time to read it this morning, he lays out for us a gospel approach to sexuality. And in there he talks about whether or not a guy should lay down, right? It's a parallel of this passage. Whether or not a guy should lay down with a prostitute. Whether or not he should be joined together, right, physically in intimacy with someone who isn't his wife. Two people who aren't married shouldn't have sex, it says, because, and he goes on and talks about the one flesh union. Throughout Genesis, we've looked at this, because all the way back in the prescribed created order, God says, right, men should leave their fathers and their mothers, right? They should be joined together with their spouse. They should leave and cleave, and that the coming together creates this new one flesh, this new thing. And so in 1 Corinthians, Paul connects that. He goes, listen, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't lay down with somebody who isn't your wife, because the purpose of the coming together is the celebration of that one flesh union. Now this is, in its day and in our day, this is not a diminishing of sex. This is not a, boy, sex is gross and horrible and so go do it with the person you love the best. Like, that was funnier than you didn't laugh. Okay, thank you. I hate having to tell you when to laugh. Right? This is an escalation. This is an elevation of sexuality. This is God saying, you guys you've diminished it. You've said sex is just about the coming together and the physical pleasure. So do with that sort of whenever and however and with whomever makes you happy. God's saying, no, our sexuality is the opportunity to build, to create, to fashion together this thing, this one flesh thing that is a miracle. Our sex is a gift inside of marriage. It's part of celebrating the uniting, the joining of man and woman into the new thing. It's a picture for us of the miraculous work. It's a celebration. It's an illustration of what God is doing as he brings husband and wife and forms them into one thing. So sex says, right, our culture, let's not talk about the culture yet. Sex says, God, in God's way, what sex says is, I belong to you, and you belong to me. And we're going to celebrate that. But the belonging is not just the physical intimacy. Right? The one flesh union is not just about people's private parts coming close together. I'm going to say that as carefully as I can say it. It's about whole people being fashioned together into a new thing. Whether that's socially, physically, relationally, economically, right? Spiritually, like all of us, We bring all of us, and that's the reason, right, when it talks about nakedness, right, because there's no thing that the other person doesn't have access to. So to God, in his economy and the way he's fashioned this, sex inside of marriage is us celebrating the reality that these two whole people are coming together in intimacy. Which is why when the culture wants to say it's just a physical act, it's because it doesn't actually understand what our sexuality is for. Sex outside of marriage is saying, I want the physical, but I don't want the rest of you. Right? A one-night stand or an affair or anything that is not husband and wife coming together in marital intimacy is someone saying, I want part of you. I want this piece of you. And I want this piece that satisfies me. And so I'm going to maybe take it. I'm not going to, right? I'm going to do this with you, but you're not going to get all of me. You're not going to get my covenant. You're not going to get my commitment and my life. It's a much lesser view of sexuality. I'm going to take the pleasure without the vulnerability and the intimacy of oneness. Now, I know that runs counter to like everything else and any other voice. The culture, right? Television, movies, magazines, like it doesn't, everybody else is saying something different than God. God says our sex is this beautiful thing over here reserved because it's spectacular and good and for this purpose. And the other voices are like, no, just take this thing and use it for yourself. That's the temptation of sex. What about the greatest temptation? There's a third temptation in here. And I think that, not that the other two, I think we'll talk about the temptation of power and the temptation of sex for us in this room. But knowing what I know about what's going on in many of the lives in the room, this third temptation is the one we've got to think about. In Genesis 37, Joseph, right, I mean, we said it, Joseph does it all wrong. His brothers, his dad, right, he's lost his mom, he's dreams and visions and things are, bowing down to here, and he's got a coat and he's telling falsehoods and he's doing all of the stuff wrong. He's self-seeking. He is not a nice guy. He's a bad guy. He's a bad brother. He's a bad son. And he ends up, right, beaten bloody in a hole, naked, sold into slavery. And by Genesis 39, we get that he's learned all of his lessons. I mean, that's what we said. That's the story that we see. He's done it. And even in the midst of the story, right, in the moment of these temptations, the temptation of power and the temptation of sexuality, right, he does the right thing. He flees the temptation. He declares that he serves God before he serves Potiphar. Like, he's done all of the right stuff. He's learned all of the lessons. He's a transformed guy. He's this kind, righteous, self-sacrificing guy. And everything is going well. And the Lord is blessing not just him, but he's blessing Potiphar. He's blessing the house. And then, in the midst of doing exactly the right thing, in the midst of fleeing the temptation, in the midst of declaring the glory of God, it all goes horribly wrong. He gets falsely accused. That Potiphar believes his wife. She consolidates power, right? He flees, she comes, she grabs a hold of him, he does the right thing, he runs away and gets away. She fabricates a story. She lies about who he is and what he's done. She holds onto his coat. She brings the other servants in, gets everybody's story on the same page. We should be careful when we speculate, but it's likely that she has slept at least with some of those men. It's at least like her character doesn't sort of just show like you've got character. And hers is likely to have been that. She has probably been consolidating her power and her control over the household for a multitude of years, and probably by sleeping with the male servants. And so that's what she's done. And so the husband comes home, Potiphar comes home, and she says, see, look, we've all got our story together. This is what Joseph did. I cried out. He ran off. He's the bad guy. I'm so innocent right here. What are you going to do to defend my honor? Joseph's done all of the right stuff for once, right? He's gotten it. He's learned his lessons. He's done the right thing. Here's the worst temptation. The temptation to despair when you've done the right thing and it's still going poorly. See, when we're doing the wrong thing and it's going poorly, we can go, if I could just get my life together, if I could just do the right thing, if I could make the hard call, if I would live a life of righteousness, things would go better. And we believe that, and we sort of live that, and there are some evidence that often that is true. But here's Joseph in the midst of the opposite. He's doing all the right stuff. He's learned all the right lessons. He's gotten it together, right? He's paying his bills. He's not cheating anybody anymore. He's not sleeping with somebody that isn't his wife. He's doing all the right stuff. And it's going wrong. He's suffering the consequences, not of his own sin at this stage, but of the sin of somebody else, of the stuff that somebody else is doing to him, of the tragic things. He's the victim. It's going poorly for him, and he's been doing all of the right stuff. And to not blame God in that moment, to not get angry at God, to not throw our hands up in the air and go, why should I even bother? If I'm going to get beat up, if bad stuff's going to happen, I might as well at least get to do the wrong stuff. Do you see the temptation that for some of us, many of us, right, we're here? Because life is not going the way that we thought that it should. We have not gotten the things we thought we should get in the midst of our new righteousness, in the midst of our now, right? Some of us have made the decision, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to do it the right way. I'm going to just love my wife, my husband, my kids. I'm going to try and be a good boss. And now the tragic, the hard, the trouble has come. See, here's the thing. We've got an advantage with Joseph's story, right? We've got a narrator and the narrator knows the end of the story. Most likely, the person who's going to have written the bulk of the book of Genesis is Moses, right? And so he's got the advantage of knowing the end of the story, of knowing all the details. And so he can see that what we know about Joseph's story is that it's going to have a great ending. Joseph is not just going to bless Potiphar's family, but the result, right, of the tragic things that come into Joseph's life, he's going to get sent back into prison. And in prison, he's going to meet these guys, and he's going to hear these dreams, and he's going to offer these interpretations, and he's going to rise again to a position of prominence and power. And he's going to do it the right way. And he's going to, because of the decisions, because of the favor of the Lord, because the Lord is with him, and he never forgets that. Right? And we know this. We know that the tragic things that are going to come into his life are the very vehicles that the Lord is going to use for his salvation. And not just his, but his family's, right? His dad and his brothers are going to come. I'm telling you all the stories that are coming in the weeks ahead. His dad and his brothers, right, they're going to come, and he's going to save them because he's going to have food and they will not starve. And not just his family, but the nation of Egypt, all of it is going to be saved. And not just his family and the nation of Egypt, but because of the rumors and the stories, the word gets out that Egypt has food when nobody else has food, right? Everybody comes, and Egypt grows to be this massive power where he sits beside Pharaoh as the most powerful guy in the whole world. And so it's sort of easy for us to go, well, we know how Joseph's story is going to happen. We know the Lord's going to use the tragedy in Joseph's life, and this is what he's going to bring about. Throughout the story, that line keeps getting repeated. The Lord is with Joseph. See, nothing can derail God's plan. And the thing that you have to remind yourself is that the Lord is with you. If you're walking with Jesus, if you've brought him, right, if you've invited him into your world and into your life, if you're a Christ follower, then the Lord is with you. And you don't get a narrator, right? None of us get narrators. At least not ones that can actually see. None of us get someone who could sort of stand up above and look at it and go, here's how all of these things are going to work together. The way that we get with Joseph. But that's the promise. The promise is the Lord is with you. And nothing can derail God's plan and purpose from being accomplished in your life. Well, that's great. Here's the 3 temptations. What do we do with those? Right? How's that helpful to us? It's great that Joseph wandered through these 3 temptations. It's even great that Joseph seems to have handled them really, really well. What can we learn? Let's think about power. I think the thing that we learn about power is, how do we use power? There's a lot of conversation in our day, politically, socially, about privilege. I don't really like the word, to be honest. Because I don't really, should be really careful how I say this. As an almost middle-aged white guy, people tell me I've got a lot of privilege. There's a lot of that language. But the implication is that somehow I didn't deserve it or earn it, or I didn't ask for it. What I do have a lot of, I'll take privilege and put it over here. What I do have a lot of is power. I've got resources. I've got time. I've got assets and intellect, and I've got ability to serve, and I've got a family, and we've got a church, right? We've got power to do something. I think it's a better word than privilege. And some of the questions, if you will start to ask yourself, what am I supposed to do with my power? Some of us in this room have an amazing amount of power. Some of us have resources beyond. Right? Some of us are ultra successful. Even some of us who would be at the bottom end of some of those things, right? We've still got time and energy and skills and abilities. What is the Lord calling us to do with our power? We have the same temptation that Joseph faced. We can consolidate it, right? We can hold it for ourselves. We can use it to grasp and to take things that aren't ours and suppress other people. Or we can go, everything that I possess, every bit of my power comes from the Lord. And so I'm going to handle it. I'm going to treat it. I'm going to spend it. Time, resources, family, church, all of it, in a way that honors Jesus. That's how I'm going to use my power. Are we so ingrained in the culture, though, right? That for some of us, what we do is we live out at the margins. We're so tapped. We don't have free time. We don't have free dollars. We don't have a free night. Because we live, right? We live where the culture says that every time we get a little bit more, we should just spend it. Borrow against it. Commit to one more thing. And in the end, we have no room left. How am I going to manage my power and my resources? Am I going to manage it like the culture, or in a way that reflects that Jesus rules in my life? That's a question we should ask ourselves about power. What about sex? It's interesting to me, Joseph's resistance of temptation looks very different than most people's. See, what most of us do in the midst of temptation, certainly in the midst of sexual temptation, since that's our story, but I think you can use it on almost any of them, is that we try to operate under self-control. And what we mean by that is, I'm going to put the cupcake on the counter and then walk by it a bunch of times. And I'm going to resist it. And if I just if I'm just going to put it, I'm going to put my thing down here, and I'm going to, what I do when I'm trying to eat less, I don't know that anybody can tell yet, but I'm trying. So when it gets to a spot when I'm full, I take my silverware or I take my napkin, right, and I intentionally shove it down on top of the food. Because that's my way of going, I'm not going to do this anymore. Now, sadly, there are occasionally days when I pick the napkin back up and scoop up some more because, it was a clean napkin and you and I both know it. Because that sort of self-control seldom really works. Or it works for a period of time, right? It works on our good days. It works on the days when we've gotten enough sleep and we're in great relationship with our spouse and our kids aren't doing anything stupid and our job is being successful. And when the world feels right, then we've got that power. We've got self-control. I can walk by the cupcake. I can turn that person down. I can say no to this thing. I can not turn that TV show on. I can not visit that website. I can not send this message. I can not respond this sort of way. But that's not what Joseph does. When the moment comes and they're in the bedroom and she's grabbed a hold of his coat, he doesn't stand there going, I refuse. He flees. He runs. He knows that she's going to turn the story, right? He's watched how the households worked. Joseph knows what the consequence of this is going to be, and he flees and runs and gets as far away as he can. He runs outside because he loves God more than he cares about the power and that he cares about the position. Earlier in Genesis, in chapter, I want to say 27, I thought I made myself a note. Anyway, in the story of Jacob and Rachel, if you remember back several weeks now, Jacob he sees Rachel, he wants to marry Rachel, and the brother tricks him, right? And says, you gotta work for 7 years. And it says to us in that story that the 7 years were like a couple of days to Jacob. Because why? Because all of the work, all of the hard, right? All of the self-control, he had some greater affection out here that he was working towards, that he was moving towards, that he was fleeing in the direction of. He could go through the hard, he could go through the temptation, right? He could go through I just want to lay down and stop doing this and go home because this is too hard and this guy's mean to me. Because of his deep love and affection and desire for Rachel. So what do we learn? Self-control isn't will suppression, it's a reordering of our desires. Our self is controlled when we love more deeply, not less. When we desire the better thing, and ultimately, right, for a follower of Jesus, it's putting our desire for him over and above everything else. And when we do that, the rest of our life gets rightly ordered. Am I attempting to manage temptation by the power of my will or the power of a greater love? And what about the greatest temptation? Right? I think for many of us, most of us probably, this is the one that's hardest. Because we can't see our story. We don't have a narrator telling us how it's going to turn out. We don't have somebody, right, sort of constantly saying to us, the Lord is with you. The Lord is with you. Even when it seems like he's quiet, even when it feels like he's abandoned, even when it feels like, right, there aren't any more visions, and there aren't any more dreams. Think about Joseph's life. When he was a young man, probably in his teens, he had seen those dreams, right? He had the visions, and the corn stalks are bowing down to him, and right, it's his dad and his brothers, and he feels this sort of sense of calling and purpose, and he doesn't really understand it, and he uses it poorly. But from that moment, the Lord seems to go quiet. No more visions, no more dreams, no burning bush for him. And it's in the midst of that, right now, the tragic things, the hard things, the troubled things have come into his life. And in this moment, when it would have been easiest to go, the Lord must not be with me anymore. Right? The really schmaltzy poster that we see, right, with the 2 footprints walking, and it's in the moments when you see just the 1 footprint, that's when I was carrying you. It's schmaltzy, but it's true. It's in those moments, right, that we need someone to look at us and go, the Lord is with you. The Lord is carrying you. The Lord is providing for you. The Lord is working this out. The Lord is not done accomplishing what he's called in your life. And while we can see Joseph's story, we can also see the story of the one who Joseph's in the line, right? We've been talking about this, that this Messiah is coming. This ultimate blessing, not just of Potiphar, not just of the nation of Israel, but the whole world, all of the nations. The one is coming who will bless. Jesus. And we can see his story. And in the same way, right, that when Jacob loved Rachel to the spot when he was willing to work, he was willing to set everything else aside because the greater love that drove him was Rachel. We're Jesus' Rachel. We're the thing, right? He came to earth and took on flesh and walked in perfection. He himself was beaten and bloodied and naked. And he endured it all. He went to the cross. Why? Because he so loved you and me. Because he so wanted to be with you and me. Can I see that the gospel is the greatest evidence that Jesus has not forgotten me, but instead has drawn near to me? That in the midst of the trouble, in the midst of the trial, in the midst of the hard, in the midst of the whatever it is that we're facing that makes us go, maybe God stopped paying attention. The cross becomes the evidence for us, the reminder for us that he has come near, that Jesus is with you. Let's pray. Father, we come. For some of us in this room, we are currently facing temptations of power. Maybe we're facing temptations of our sexuality. But I believe that most of us are facing the greatest temptation. In the midst of hard, in the midst of trouble, in the midst of trial, the doubt, the questions, did God abandon me? Did he forget about me? Has he left me behind? Have I outsinned his grace? May the story this morning, may the truth of the way we watch you walk with Joseph say to us, the Lord is with us. The Lord is with us. The Lord is with us. And that's a spot we can rest. It's a spot we can trust. It's a spot when the storm rages and the boat sinks and the whale swallows. It's a spot when we get thrown into prison. It's a spot when we lose our job. It's a spot when we didn't get the thing we thought we deserved and earned because of our goodness. The Lord is with us. And Father, we rejoice here. We rest here. We stand here. We lay on our faces here because the Lord is with us. Thank you. We pray these things in the great name of Jesus. Amen.